The world had already been wiped clean. Not partially, not symbolically, but completely. According to the account of the Great Flood, everything that breathed outside the ark was erased. Civilization collapsed. Bloodlines ended. Whatever once dominated the earth was gone. Or at least that's what we've been led to believe. Centuries later, on a battlefield that should have belonged only to ordinary men, a figure steps forward, towering, armored, impossible to ignore. Goliath. Not a legend, not a myth whispered through generations, a warrior, documented, described in detail. And here's where the problem begins. If the flood truly reset humanity, if every corrupted line was destroyed, then what is he doing here? Not just existing but fighting, representing a people, standing as if he came from something older, something that should not have survived. And Goliath is not the only one. The deeper you look, the more the pattern begins to break the narrative. Because scattered across the post-flood world are traces of something familiar, something large, something powerful, something that wasn't supposed to come back. So the question isn't just who was Goliath. The real question is far more unsettling. What if the flood didn't erase everything? After the waters receded, the world did not return to chaos, it reorganized. Nations formed, territories were claimed, lineages spread outward from a single surviving family. On the surface, it looked like a clean reset, a controlled beginning for humanity. But beneath that order, something begins to surface again. Not everywhere, not randomly. In specific regions, the same kind of presence appears. Ancient texts begin to reference groups described as unusually large, unusually powerful, feared by entire populations. They are not isolated figures. They are identified as peoples, clans, established inhabitants of the land. Among them, one name rises repeatedly, the Rephaim. They are not introduced as newcomers. They're spoken of as if they belong, as if they have been there long enough to define territories. Entire regions become associated with them. Valleys bear their name. Lands are remembered because of their presence. And they are not alone. Other groups emerge alongside them, distinct but eerily similar in description. Tall, dominant, unsettling to encounter. The kind of presence that shifts the psychology of anyone who sees them. This is no longer about a single giant on a battlefield. This is about a pattern. A pattern that suggests something survived or something re-emerged in places where it would matter most. And the deeper you trace these groups, the clearer it becomes. They weren't scattered. They were positioned. These groups were not myths told from a distance. They were encountered, seen, measured, feared. When explorers moved into the land of Canaan, they didn't just report fertile ground or fortified cities. They came back with something far more unsettling. They spoke of people so large, so imposing, that comparison itself began to break down. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own sight. That wasn't poetry. That was perception collapsing under pressure. Among these were the Anakim figures rooted deep in the southern highlands, tied to cities like Hebron, where legacy and dominance seemed to run through generations. Their presence wasn't temporary. It was established, almost inherited, as if the land itself remembered them. Alongside them, other names surface: Emim, Zamzemim, different regions, different identities, but carrying the same underlying description: great, tall, formidable. And then, further east, the pattern intensifies. In the region known as Bashan, the land itself earns a reputation, not because of its soil or its cities, but because of who ruled it. The Rephaim were not just present there, they defined it. This is where the narrative shifts, because now we're no longer looking at scattered reports or exaggerated encounters. We're looking at territories shaped by their existence, regions where their presence wasn't an anomaly, it was the standard. And once you see that, one thing becomes difficult to ignore. This wasn't random survival, it was continuity. Continuity at this scale doesn't happen without structure, and structure leaves evidence. As these regions come into focus, a pattern begins to sharpen, not just of presence, but of dominance. These were not fringe groups hiding at the edges of civilization. They occupied strategic terrain, elevated ground, defensible cities, trade routes. They didn't survive quietly. They established control. In the southern highlands, the Anakim were anchored in strongholds like Hebron, a city with deep-rooted legacy. In the Transjordan, entire territories carried reputations tied to giant populations, lands remembered not for agriculture or culture, but for the beings who ruled them. And then there's Bashan, a region so consistently associated with giants that it becomes known as a land defined by them. Not metaphorically, historically, the kind of place where encountering something larger than life wasn't unexpected, it was normal. At the center of that power stood a figure who shifts the narrative entirely, Og. Not just a giant, but a king. Ruler of fortified cities, commander of a territory that resisted invasion. A presence so physically overwhelming that even later records preserve the dimensions of his resting place as proof of scale. This changes the equation, because once giants begin to rule, they are no longer anomalies in the system. They become the system. And that raises a far more strategic question. Were these just remnants trying to survive, or were they rebuilding power in a world that had just been reset? Once power consolidates, it doesn't stay isolated. It expands, influences, and reshapes the world around it. And that's exactly what begins to happen. These giant lineages are no longer just occupying land. They are embedded in the political fabric of the post-flood world. Kingdoms rise where they rule. Borders form where they dominate. Their presence is not just physical, it's structural. And then another figure emerges, one that shifts the narrative beyond a single region. Nimrod, described not merely as a man, but as a mighty one on the earth, a builder of cities, an architect of early civilization. His influence stretches across key locations: Babel, Erech, Akkad, centers of power, centers of control. But here's where it becomes interesting. In some ancient translations and traditions, the word used to describe him aligns with the same category used for giants. Not just strong, but something more. Something elevated beyond ordinary human stature, whether physically, politically, or both. Now the pattern deepens. You have Og ruling fortified territories, Nimrod establishing early empires. Different regions, different roles, same underlying signal power concentrated in figures described as mighty beyond normal men. This isn't coincidence, it's convergence. Because whether through size, influence, or lineage, these individuals represent something that refused to be ordinary in a world that had supposedly been reset to normal. And if that's true, then the rise of giants after the flood wasn't just about survival, it was about dominance. But dominance alone doesn't explain the deeper anomaly. Power can rise, kingdoms can form, strong men can shape history. But this feels different because the descriptions don't just emphasize influence, they emphasize difference. A physical, almost unsettling distinction that separates these figures from ordinary humanity. Not just stronger, not just more strategic, but something that evokes the same reaction across generations: fear. Disproportionate fear. Entire populations didn't just resist them, they hesitated, they calculated, they withdrew, and that kind of psychological impact doesn't come from power alone. It comes from presence. This is where the narrative begins to fracture. Because if these were simply powerful human rulers, then why are they consistently grouped under terms that echo something older? Why are entire tribes described in ways that mirror pre-flood accounts? Why does the language feel repeated? It's as if history didn't restart, it resumed. And that leads us into the most uncomfortable layer of this entire mystery. If the world was truly cleansed, then what mechanism allowed something so distinct, so recognizable, to appear again with the same traits, the same impact, and the same dominance? At this point, the question is no longer what happened, it's how it happened. Because when you press into the how, the narrative stops being comfortable and starts becoming contested. There is no single clean explanation. Instead, what emerges is a collision of theories, each trying to explain the same undeniable reality: giants existed after the flood, and no direct explanation is given for their return. One line of thought suggests continuity through lineage. That, somehow within the family that survived the flood, a genetic trait remained hidden, recessive, waiting, passed silently through generations until it reappeared in concentrated regions like Kana, manifesting again in groups like the Anakim and the Rephaim. It's a controlled explanation, almost clinical, but it raises its own tension. Because if that were true, then the flood didn't fully eliminate what it was meant to remove. It carried it forward. Another perspective rejects genetics entirely and leans into something far more disruptive. It proposes that whatever event led to the existence of giants before the flood happened again. Not survival, repetition, a second emergence, a reintroduction of something that had already once corrupted the natural order. It's a theory that explains the similarity, but at the cost of introducing a cycle the text never clearly confirms. And then there is the third perspective, less dramatic, more grounded, that these giants were not something supernatural at all, but simply powerful human clans, exceptionally tall, militarily dominant, and magnified through the lens of fear and storytelling. No hidden DNA, no second incursion, just men who felt larger than life. 3 explanations, 3 directions, and not one of them is fully confirmed. Which leaves us exactly where the narrative seems to want us, surrounded by evidence, but denied a clear answer. And when answers are unclear, patterns become everything. Because regardless of which theory you lean toward, one fact remains consistent: these giants are not evenly distributed. They cluster. They appear in specific zones again and again across generations. Regions like Bashan, Hebron, and the Philistine territories don't just mention giants, they become defined by them. That kind of concentration is not accidental, it suggests boundaries, influence, possibly even control. Take the Philistine city of Gath. By the time the narrative reaches the era of kings, Gath isn't just another fortified city, it becomes a known stronghold for giants. Not one, but multiple. A lineage preserved in a single location, as if that region became a final refuge. And this raises a strategic implication. What if these weren't scattered survivors, but contained populations? Confined, isolated, reduced, but not erased. It would explain why the presence of giants feels both persistent and limited at the same time. Why they dominate certain areas, yet never reclaim the entire world. It also explains something else, something critical. Why every major encounter with them feels decisive, as if each battle wasn't just territorial, but eliminative. And if that's true, then every confrontation with giants wasn't random conflict. It was part of something much bigger, a gradual erasure of a presence that had no clear origin, but a very visible impact. Which brings us to the moment where that presence reaches its most iconic form. Not in a kingdom, not in a tribe, but in a single figure, standing on a battlefield, waiting. He doesn't arrive quietly. He steps forward deliberately, repeatedly into the open space between 2 armies. Not rushing into battle, not hiding behind ranks, but positioning himself where everyone can see him. A challenge not just to soldiers, but to identity, to courage, to belief. Goliath of Gath. Everything about him is designed to overwhelm. His height stretches beyond normal proportion. His armor is not just protective, it's excessive, layered in bronze, heavy enough to slow an ordinary man. The shaft of his spear is described like a weaver's beam, thick, weighted, engineered for impact rather than speed. This is not just a warrior, this is a spectacle of dominance. And yet, what makes him truly significant isn't his size, it's where he comes from. Gath, one of the last known strongholds where giant lineages remained after earlier campaigns had already reduced them elsewhere. A place where remnants weren't just surviving, they were consolidating, which means Goliath isn't an isolated figure rising from nowhere. He is the product of continuity, a living extension of everything that came before, every tribe, every territory, every pattern that survived the flood and re-established itself over time. And if that's true, then facing him wasn't just facing a man, it was confronting a legacy. A legacy that had been building, quietly, persistently, waiting for its moment to stand in full view. And the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. Goliath was never meant to stand alone. Because the moment you look beyond the battlefield, the illusion of a lone giant collapses. Goliath was not the beginning, and he was certainly not the only one. Ancient records point to others from the same region, warriors of similar stature, similar description, emerging from the same place, Gath. Not scattered across nations, but concentrated, connected, related. A cluster, not a coincidence. Among them were figures like Ishbi-Benob, armed with weapons heavy enough to overwhelm even seasoned fighters. Others followed Saf, Lami, each encountered in separate battles, each requiring a different warrior to bring them down. Different names, same pattern. And then one detail stands out above all. One of these giants is described with an anomaly: 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits in total. Not just size, but variation, a biological marker that suggests inheritance, not randomness. This is where the narrative sharpens, because now we are no longer dealing with isolated individuals who happen to be large. We are looking at a lineage, a family, a continuation of something that has been passed down, generation after generation, concentrated in a single stronghold as the rest of the world moves on. And this transforms the entire encounter. When Goliath steps onto that battlefield, he is not representing himself. He is representing a bloodline that refused to disappear, a remnant that held its ground while everything else around it changed. And that raises a deeper, more unsettling realization. Defeating him wouldn't be enough, because as long as the lineage remained, the presence remained. And history shows it did. Because the fall of one giant did not end the conflict, it exposed it. After the defeat of Goliath, the narrative doesn't close the chapter, it expands it. The battlefield shifts, the encounters multiply, and the same pattern resurfaces in different moments against different warriors. Not one opponent, multiple, each emerging from the same lineage, the same stronghold, the same unresolved past. These were not random skirmishes, they were targeted confrontations. Figures like Ishbi-Benob don't just appear, they seek out the king himself. Others rise in separate battles, forcing different warriors to step in, as if the responsibility of ending this lineage had to be distributed, completed piece by piece. And slowly, over time, the pattern begins to reverse. Where once giants dominated regions, now they are being tracked. Where once they ruled, now they are being hunted. The balance shifts, not instantly but decisively. Each encounter reduces the presence, each battle narrows the bloodline. Each victory removes another fragment of something that had persisted for generations, until what was once a widespread network becomes a shrinking remnant. Confined, isolated, exposed. And this is where the story quietly reaches its turning point. Not in a single victory, but in a series of eliminations that begin to close the gap between presence and disappearance. Because what follows is not just decline, it is near erasure. And yet even here the narrative leaves something unresolved. Because even as the presence fades, the explanation never arrives. The battles are recorded. The victories are clear. The decline of these giant lineages is undeniable. But the text never pauses to answer the one question that sits beneath all of it. Where did they come from after everything was supposed to be wiped out? There is no direct clarification, no moment where the narrative steps back and explains the mechanism, the process, the origin. Only silence. And that silence is what forces interpretation. Some argue that the answer lies within the surviving lineage itself, that something was carried through the flood, embedded within the very family meant to restart humanity. A dormant trait, invisible at first but capable of resurfacing generations later in concentrated forms. Others reject that entirely. They point instead to the possibility that whatever produced giants before the flood was not limited to that moment, that the conditions, whatever they were, repeated. Not survival, but recurrence, a second emergence that mirrors the first. And then there are those who take a different route altogether. They strip away the supernatural and reduce the phenomenon to human terms, exceptional height, genetic anomalies, amplified through fear, memory, and storytelling. No hidden lineage, no recurring event, just men remembered as something more. Three directions, all plausible, none confirmed. And that is where the tension tightens, because the narrative gives you outcomes, but withholds origins. It shows you the end of giants, without ever fully revealing their beginning in the world after the flood. And that gap is where the mystery lives. And the deeper you sit with that gap, the more deliberate it begins to feel, because the narrative doesn't lack detail. It records locations with precision. It names tribes, cities, rulers. It describes encounters, battles, even physical traits with striking clarity. This is not careless storytelling. It is selective storytelling, which means the absence of explanation is not weakness, it's restraint. The kind of restraint that forces the reader to focus not on how they came back, but on what their presence meant once they did.